Hello, and welcome to another episode of Out of the Fire podcast, where we talk about all sorts of things, usually around healthcare and interoperability and data. This episode, I am really glad to have Mark Kramer here, or Dr. Mark Kramer, and you are a incredible person and an authority in this space. Would you mind giving a little introduction?
Sure. Thank you, Gene, for having me on. I go way back in time. I was first educated at University of Michigan, then Princeton University, where I got my PhD. These were both in chemical engineering. In my early 20s, I joined MIT as an assistant professor, 10 years teaching in the chemical engineering department. Of course, all through this time, I was very interested in computing. And in fact, the majority of my research at MIT had to do with AI. In those days, it was expert systems and neural networks. And I was applying that to chemical processes. And I have a bunch of publications from back in those days. Funny things have happened. But we can talk about that more. Then I went to an AI company called GenSim, spent another decade there, so 2 decades into my career. That was, I think, the first successful AI company that, made a commercial go of it. We started off with when I joined, it was under 20 people. When I left, it was about 350 people, and we had deployments all over the world of AI that was controlling manufacturing plants, doing transportation systems, all sorts of industrial processes. And these were online working systems, which was in the 90s, if you can believe it. Then I sort of went to a couple of startups that didn't take root. I ended up at MITRE around 2005, where I'm currently still at, 25. So that's a 20-year career. I'm just about to have my 20th anniversary at MITRE. And MITRE is an interesting company for those of you that don't know. It's kind of like a national lab. It's a nonprofit, or we say not-for-profit. Don't want to take a loss. We work for the federal government. 90 plus percentage of our work is with the federal government, working in the public interest. So we work across the government, everything from Department of Defense to Health and Human Services and everything in between. My niche at the moment is with Health and Human Services, particularly the healthcare portfolio. So we support that mission or missions. And I've been very happy there because it's a project-oriented company. So I get to change what I do every few months or years. And that keeps me very happy. And my current position there is as a chief engineer. Chief engineers have oversight of sort of the technical quality and direction of where our program goes. And my division is the Health and Society Innovation Center. So that's a quick synopsis of what I've done professionally.
Thank you, Mark, for that. And for those of you that don't know, MITRE is actually one of those companies that even maybe you've heard of, you've not heard, but has been very instrumental in adoption of FIRE and HL7 standards and other things. Am I right to say that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we traditionally have not been a healthcare oriented company. So around the mid 2000s or aughts, I guess, like 2006, 2007, we started getting into healthcare primarily through the leadership of my boss at the time, Harry Sleeper. Incredible guy, very visionary, and we started wondering, why healthcare seemed to be many, many years behind other industries and sectors. And in fact, it's a longish story, but towards the end of the aughts, we wrote a paper that suggested the use of RESTful interfaces, APIs. It was unheard of. Everything was sending documents from one place to another, like CDAs, right? Or at that time it was CCDs. And we said, there's this thing on the web that's called REST, and we ought to be using APIs. And this was 2008, 2009. We came up with this idea. We called it H data for health data. And that's when I first got involved with HL7 because we said, this isn't going to have any impact unless we go through the dominant standards organization in healthcare. So we took H data to HL7. And of course, they didn't want to hear anything about, anything like that. And we eventually hooked up with one work group kind of that wasn't at the center of many things and drove that to a standard. We went through the HL7 process, which is a lengthy thing. And I remember in 2011, we had a meeting at MITRE. Our headquarters is down in Virginia. I'm located in Massachusetts. And none other than Graham Grieve was there. And I remember we had a presentation where we explained the principles of H data and RESTful interfaces. And, happy to share it, of course. And a few months later, it was probably less than half a year later, Graham announced he was working on something called FHIR. And lo and behold, the principles of FHIR were RESTful interfaces, stateless interactions, blah, 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 the kinds of things we articulated in H data. Now, I don't want to take anything away from Graham because his leadership in FHIR and his creativity and perseverance are unrivaled, in this community. He's a force of nature. But yeah, I'm just explaining where we started in healthcare. Now, as we've gone by through many years, we've been involved with many different things. We've been involved with quality measures. I was involved very early with CQL, the clinical quality language. We realized that we needed synthetic data because when you're trying out things, you're likely to spill data. You can't really work with PII or PHI. And so we came up with Cynthia. One of my proudest moments is coming up with that name, Cynthia. And I give full credit to my colleague, Jay Walanowski, who has really driven it forward. We also were very early on trying to implementation guides, to write implementation guides. And this was before there were any kind of rules around how that was done. There was no, I don't know whether your listeners know about the IG publisher, but with FHIR, you write implementation guides which show how or explain how to use FHIR in a given application, right? Because FHIR is kind of a framework. And it was very painful. I have to tell you, it was in the early days, writing an IG was nothing like the experience now. And to make it a little bit less painful for myself and the people at MITRE who were engaged in writing IGs, and there was a big team of those back in those days, we came up with the idea of FHIR shorthand. So we proposed that to the FHIR infrastructure group, and FHIR shorthand, we came up with a good name. It wasn't called that at first, and then a name makes a big difference. And so that became how everyone writes implementation guides. And now, of course, there's hundreds of implementation guides, which is part of the problem I think that we're trying to solve, and I think it's self-created to some extent. Anyway, there are lots of stories between then and now, in the HL7 world and standards, which has led us to the point we are at the moment.
Fascinating, fascinating. I did not know that you created Cynthia and FHIR shorthand and all these other things probably that people use every day. Um, uh, yeah, uh, somebody has to come up with the ideas. Do you feel like the community in FHIR is a community where these ideas are actually able to be, implemented and take hold? Because I know um, APIs are probably like a standard way to communicate, and yes, they started to kind of be standard in and around the last 10 years. But where do you think that the need really came from to have the healthcare standard like FHIR now, even though we're still living in that world of exchanging the documents, right? Talking about TEFCA, I think I heard
Sure.
something like less than 5% of TEFCA data is in FHIR yet. That's still CCDAs.
Yeah.
But it sounds like that's going to change hopefully very soon.
So let
What
me
are your
pick that
thoughts on?
apart, because there are a couple of questions in there. First of all, the standards community is very conservative. I think to some extent that's by design. And the healthcare industry is also very conservative as well because patient safety is at risk. And it's not an IT driven sector. A lot of things do happen, obviously, through digital applications, but it isn't sort of essentially, driven by IT. It uses IT when it has to. I guess it's kind of a laggard in this industry. So now you got a domain that tends not to lead in digitalization, and you've got a standards organization that is slow moving almost by design. And it takes a while to institute organizational change. And we're talking about organizational change across a big, big domain. So it isn't surprising to me that you still have HL7V2 and you have CDA. And that's the way, if a system works, why change it? That's the situation, I think, with fire. When things are broken and they need to be fixed, they'll be fixed fast. But if they're working and, not completely broken, they'll survive a long time. So you still see a lot of, hospital communications in V2. It's like layer upon layer. So with respect to fire, what is it that it offers that previous systems did not? And I think we're finding out that the kind of thing you can do by searching across multiple care locations, actually, you can do that as long as you have identity. You can exchange documents, and merging the documents is a little bit dicey, but so it would be with fire as well. So it's partially, that my journey here has been getting a little frustrated with the pace of change with fire. The adoption rate is quite slow. I already said fire 2011, so that's 14 years of fire. Now, the early versions of fire were kind of immature, right? So you got to wait till version 3 or version 4 before you see kind of a stable platform. R4 is still probably the most widely used version, and then people aren't really moving to 5 or 6. I guess 5 to some extent. 6 is still, being developed. So it's a slow process. And of course, with my background in AI and interest that really has been reborn in the last few years, of course, I ask myself, is there a better way? Is there a different way to, make progress? So yeah, that's where we are, kind of questioning whether or not, there's another pivot here, like the pivot that we had in, 2011 and 12 or so, away from documents towards APIs. Can we use AI to somehow unleash the value that is there, reduce costs, benefit patients? It's not about the technology, obviously. It's about whether or not we can move the state of the art. There's so many different friction points in our healthcare non-system in the US that, costs a lot of money, make it very difficult to access care, some of which, I guess if you're conspiracy oriented, you might say it's by design, but it's a for-profit
Yeah.
system, so you can't blame people for pursuing profit.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is a great segue into what could be next, or what could be where do we go from here, essentially, and how I'll just touch on a little bit how we met this weekend, HL7 Connectathon in Pittsburgh, actually, which is my hometown. So it was by chance, I think, that you guys had actually, prior to that, posted, I think, on LinkedIn and other platforms that there was a new working group being started. Do you want to talk about that? How that came up between you and Josh Mandel, and kind of like even prior to the Connectathon, how that idea just
Yeah,
came out?
yeah. So, I mean, I've known Josh a while, and he's brilliant, a brilliant guy, This is Josh Mandel of Microsoft, and he's been a proponent of open source software, and MITRE has been as well. So we share that. And he's also Harvard educated, non-practicing MD, a great computer programmer, my God, really talented. So I think, he had earlier this year, we both started sounding off about different approaches to interoperability involving language. And I was calling it language first interoperability. And so I reached out to Josh, and since we were both posting on essentially the same topic, I suggested the idea of a connectathon. And we didn't know whether HL7 would say yes or no, because it's kind of a crazy topic for HL7, but they were very supportive. And as you know, there were 3 different tracks at this Connectathon dealing with AI. And yeah, so I mean, we talked about where we should, sort of convene a group, and we decided that the logistical benefits of doing it through HL7 were not worth turning down. So that's what we did. The whole idea of using language, Gene, it sort of comes from my experiences with terminology and some of the things I got involved with maybe 5 to 7 years ago. There is a group of people in HL7 who really believe in model. FIRE isn't the ideal model. OpenEHR is another competitive model. But the whole goal is to come up with detailed models of every kind of healthcare information. Stan Huff has led this kind of effort to come up with detailed clinical models so that when you report a lab, for example, you know exactly what fields there are, what units there can be, how the results are, like blood pressure has so many different bells and whistles on it. Are you exercising? Are you sitting? Are you standing? Weight has, are you wearing clothes? Are you not wearing clothes? Blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, the dream is to model healthcare information. And I think I was sucked into that. And there's some beautiful models, but in reality, mapping real data into models robustly is a really difficult thing to do. All the nuances and context, very difficult. So one of the things that Dan always used to do is give talks about pre and post coordination of terms. So for example, if you have, let's say, pneumonia in the left lung, you can formulate that with codes in different ways. Left is a code and pneumonia is a code, or it might be pre-coordinated, and you may say left lung pneumonia. And there are different ways to report that as codes. And it just started ringing my bell that what we say is always the same thing. Pneumonia in the left lung. But if you don't code it, it's always the same, and it's easily understandable to any human. So thank goodness large language models come along, and they understand language in a way that approaches or surpasses many humans. And I don't have to go through the evolution of large language models, but yeah, they understand medical stories very, very well, and they don't require coding. Coding is almost, I guess I regard it as kind of a solution to a problem that maybe doesn't exist anymore. I'm going to get in trouble for saying that because people will argue vociferously for semantic interoperability because we've got codes. We know exactly what we're talking about because we have codes. But, actually, doctors, laymen manage to talk to each other and communicate semantic ideas just fine. And if we don't understand it, we ask for clarifications. And so if someone says, mild liver disease, and you're looking for patients in your, patient population, what does mild mean? Well, ask a question and, clarify what's meant and then go look for those patients. So I think we're entering an age, Gene, where language is going to predominate our communications. And it may be that we can migrate away from this dream of a medical data model that is universal and useful for every purpose, because the purposes are very diverse. And, the kinds of things we need to know if you're going to a mental health appointment versus a, osteopathic appointment, they're very, very different. So I guess I have to say the bottom line is I believe in language as a means of communication, as we are doing right now.
Right. And it's interesting that you brought up the semantic interoperability as one of the strengths, of FIRE, and how LLMs potentially take us to a point where we could have interoperability without needing to come up with these complex coding systems. Do you feel like the coding itself kind of came out of the desire to maybe enhance the way we do the billing of the services,
Yeah.
and
No, I
the
mean,
fact that
really,
you need to have a code for every different,
yeah.
type of thing that you can bill. And it's more or less of, an artifact of like patient care as more towards, being able to bill the fee for service models that we have. And the healthcare, the medical profession itself is very old, obviously, right? And the codes really came out of, maybe the last 15 years or so. We've had these complex coding systems. And I may get in trouble here of misstating that, but please correct
Yeah,
me.
well,
Uh,
exactly right. I mean, CPT code, so you get paid for the procedure that you perform. And I'm not trying to take that away, in any way, shape. But we need to have that. I mean, there's a standard set of services that one performs in healthcare, and there has to be a standard. There has to be a schedule of payments that's attached to those services. It can't be, I kind of did this operation and maybe you'll pay me for something like that. Okay, so codes have a role. But what happened was that they started to create large code systems for clinical care to represent almost every aspect of anatomy and pathology. And you look at something like SNOMED, it's a marvelously detailed, huge edifice of codes, and it's got an internal logic, and it's kind of beautiful. You can see what's a subset of what, how things are related, and it is, really an achievement. I wouldn't criticize the people who are working on SNOMED, like Linda Bird is amazing. But it was created to solve a semantic interoperability problem so that when we use a code, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Language independent, if you're speaking Japanese and I'm speaking English, we can still communicate. But my contention is that you can do that using language and especially even translation. We can still communicate. And if you don't get exactly what I'm talking about, you can ask a question. So we started using codes, clinical codes, to solve a semantic interoperability problem. Actually, building those code systems is now a problem in and of itself. There's a never ending process to build more and more detail and more new technology, and scientific learning into coding systems. I just think that process has lost sight of the goal of semantic interoperability. Communicating. That's the goal. Communicating, and it's like it used to be to solve a problem. Now it is part of the problem. Sorry to say.
Yeah, and it seems like we need more and more complex solutions to handle that, right? And I think that that's one of the things we're seeing with fires, even how you manage value sets and terminologies, and how much of a now like important part of the overall equation that is. Which is to say that's a good problem to have because you have some way to define things that maybe haven't been formally defined in an organization, and it's good to have agreement on clinical care and standards and outcomes and encourage quality. So fascinating to hear your thoughts on that. And I guess we can dive into conversational interoperability.
Yeah,
Like,
let's do that.
what do you think is what do you think is conversational interoperability, first of
Yeah,
all?
let's define
And
it. Yeah.
some takeaways from this weekend's Connectathon that we can talk about. And then, yeah, I would just love to hear your ideas and the kind of future what if.
Yeah, so let me start off by saying the term conversational interoperability is about 6 days old. So anything I say is out on a limb. So I hope all your listeners will understand that. So what is it? So conversational interoperability is an approach to information exchange, which is built around two parties talking to each other. And those two parties are AI agents or one AI agent talking to a human. It could be, there's a human in the loop on either side, right? It could be. And the idea is to simply ask. One starts with a goal, like I'd like to refer a patient to your practice. What do I have to do that? And the other agent, which has criteria perhaps for making appointments, and perhaps it has an appointment book available to it, will have enough information to reply and say, all right, well, what condition is it that your patient is being referred for? And, the conversation will continue until there's uh, a set of information that is sufficient to successfully refer the patient, maybe, sort of a little bit of light history and history of present condition. And that referral then is sent in plain text from one party to the other, from the patient advocate or the provider that's doing the referral to the referring physician, to the specialist physician. And that information can be sent. So, fait accompli, you then have a referral. And just to hold that in contrast with the way that a standards oriented approach would work, is that you would have to have a implementation guide, probably takes several years to build. I think there is one actually for medical referrals, hasn't been implemented as far as I know. And that's another story, the shelfware aspects of implementation guides, which, because we've given fire shorthand to everyone, they can crank those out. That's just another story. But yeah, the idea is pretty darn simple, and it has to do with a conversation. And all we're really doing is we're taking the computers into the human world rather than taking the human world and trying to translate our thoughts and our needs in a way that computers can handle. And I do want to say this, Gene, before we move on, that I've been in this area of computers for God knows how long, 45 years or so. And it's always been assumed that you've got to take a problem and translate it into computerese, whatever it is, a mathematical model, a set of structured data, whatever it is, because we've got to serve that computer. The computer will serve us only when we first serve the computer. And I am really looking forward to the era where the computer comes to us and communicates and serves us in the same realm of our capabilities. And we're seeing that, and it's very, very exciting to me, at least.
It's exciting, and I think that's a great take on that. Is that we kind of through LLMs we've taught the computer to speak the same language that humans speak in a way, even though I think you could argue that they're not really speaking; they're just outputting algorithms or creating very complex, determinations which word and which letter comes next, and able to keep these very
Yeah.
large spatial representations of things that humans can't. So it's almost like we've created a new thing in a way that can use the same language we use. And it'll be interesting how that evolves. And do you feel like this replacing of the almost the programming now? I think who was that said, was it Bill Gates that said 90% of programming is going to be done by AI by the end of this year, or something like that. I think I might be.
Yeah, it may not be Bill Gates. It may have been Sam Altman, or it may have been
Came out by one
the
of those.
CEO
Right.
of Anthropic, maybe. And the
Yeah. Yeah.
90% is a number that may not be right, but everyone I know at MITRE who is doing programming is using some sort of AI aid. In
Yeah.
fact, for years I didn't do programming, and then I started again because of vibe coding, a term I don't like at all.
Right.
But
Yeah.
yeah, it gives you enough to be dangerous if you know what you're doing, even a little.
Yeah, and interestingly, so if you have this conversational ability, and we're building this complex system to enable exchange of healthcare information, to really what end are we doing that? All right, we're doing that towards the end of enhancing the outcomes for the patient, enhancing our lives, being able to care for one another better, for our family, our children. If we can do that better using this conversational interface, do we still need a traditional interoperability, right? Or is it that we are utilizing conversations to enable the context around the traditional interoperability so that when data is exchanged, it is exchanged for a specific purpose rather than just moving the data around.
I think that's a great question. And I was asking myself that exact question. In fact, I just published yesterday, I pushed something to LinkedIn, which talks about the relationship between conversational interoperability and standards based interoperability. So I do think there's a role for standards based interoperability because there's a baseline of health data that applies to almost every situation. We're talking medications, procedures, conditions, demographics. And there's especially with just think about addresses, you got to standardize an address because there's so much processing, the automatic processing. But when you get into the nuance of a patient history, and especially when you get into, you know, specialty problems, like you're dealing with liquid tumors. And that's an area that I've been involved with as well. One of my big projects at MITRE has been M-Code, which is a way to standardize oncology data. for both solid and liquid tumors. We've done both now. And, building a consensus for that was very lengthy. It took a lot of time. And I fear that, we got the basic oncology data, but then really to solve problems of what drug to give next, you have to get into some really hairy details. And it's different for every cancer. And if you know, like some of the, well, I mean, they're huge books, which talk about the diagnosis and treatment of hundreds of different types of cancer, and it's genomic information. It's really hard to build a model a priori that is going to capture that information. So the basic idea is that the mainline data is always going to be like standards oriented. And then when you get into the specialty areas, and that could be in payment as well, like, it doesn't just have to be clinical, but there are lots of edge cases in payment that like prior auth, every disease is different, every state is different. It becomes hairy like that as well. So that's where I think, standards break down. We're never going to get there using standards. And one of the points of evidence that I will come back to is the number of implementation guides that have been written, but not implemented. So there's a ton of use cases. There's a lot of thought and effort gone into that, but there's just not a large enough stakeholder community to implement that. We worked for 7 to 8 years to get the oncology community to embrace MCODE through the Codex Accelerator. A lot of people put a lot of time into that, and I think it's paid off, but that's a fairly big community, but it was still a battle to get standards to take root there. And there's an opportunity cost that's involved with that, process of building a standard, getting the community together, getting everyone to agree on what the core data is. And it's only the core data. It's not the real important data that, may be on the edge of that. There's a huge opportunity cost. So if we can do it faster, it's all for the better.
That's fascinating about that work. I'll have to check out MCODE. And I know oncology is a big area of focus right now with I think there's a cancer moonshot project going on as well. And extremely important area. I think to your point in terms of like the codification and the desire to kind of codify a lot of things and then apply them. Human nature by itself is non-deterministic, right? So when people talk about clinical guidelines and medical guidelines and quality measurement, there's that perception that that's a very concrete, deterministic thing, where I think if in reality, if you talk about two different providers, they will give you two different viewpoints on how to treat a particular ailment or condition. And that's why there is such a variation in medical practice guidelines across the country, right? There's geographic areas, historical. So I think that some of the argument that, how can we go away from the deterministic? I need to have a value set of the codes, right? I need to have these exclusions and inclusions to be, we understand from a measurement perspective, but from really, if you're talking about medical care, it's by nature non-deterministic, right?
Sometimes that ambiguity is intentional. If you have a clinical trial and you're describing inclusion-exclusion criteria, one of the examples you just presented, it can be left open in some sense. You're going to have like black and white criteria like age, but then you're going to have some softer criteria, which is like willingness to participate, disease, and that, well, I mean, some of that is quite intentional to get people into trials. If you make it if you don't leave the door open for some people who may want to get onto the trial, they're not clearly in the exclusion category. It'll take longer to do your recruitment process. So, yeah, I think there are a lot of gray areas that human communication has evolved to be ambiguous when it needs to be ambiguous and be sharply deterministic when it needs to be deterministic. And that's a strength, not a weakness.
So I think like the excited part for me was where I was really almost like I couldn't put down my laptop this weekend while we were sitting there with Josh and the whole team of just amazing. And if you haven't checked out Mark's and Josh's posts on conversational interoperability, this newly coined term from this weekend, please go and check it out. there's really was a huge number of amazing kind of hands-on projects that were, put into practice and tested during this Connectathon. And for me personally, my grandmother died of breast cancer many years ago when I was a little boy. In fact, my family came from Russia when I was, 12 years old. And my grandmother, unfortunately, could not come with us. She passed away, and there was a lack of medical care, obviously, at that point in the Soviet Union. So she couldn't get the care that she got. And I was very interested in taking the use case of the breast cancer screening, which is really a huge way to catch breast cancer. And having that personal story, I worked on this agent that evaluated a patient's information for breast cancer screening, and I recommended a screening, and then also attempted to schedule an appointment after that. And just seeing that actually take place in the Banterop platform that Josh Mandel built, and then my own platform that I vibe coded over a number of days prior to the Connectathon, and have them both have a real conversation that not only was, automated, took place in a very quick fashion. It also was valid from a perspective of it knew answers to the questions that were posed between two totally separate systems without needing to kind of pre-program that, which was like just fascinating. And I think there was a couple of examples on the Connectathon where you could see the responses of the agent even to questions that were factually wrong, and the agent actually caught that and came back and asked the question again. In my use case, that was when the scheduling system came back with some providers that it wanted to schedule, and the agent actually said, "Wait a second, this is not a California provider. This is in Massachusetts. I'm looking to schedule with a California provider in this zip code." So like even that level was just amazing to me about the potential of having that built-in, understanding of the subject matter and the potential it has to reach so many more people than now. You would have to call the office, have that conversation. You don't even get to ask questions like that until you see a doctor. Does that open up a whole new world, really, of
In a way, it's
possibilities?
opening up a whole old world, because back in the day, you would always have a communication which would, be human based. And of course, with the stress, financial stress, it's harder and harder to have those conversations. And I know just what you mean, because if you read through some of the conversations between the agents, they're very human like. They're a little polite, and more so than a human would be, probably a little bit more stilted. But it's actually, when you read them, it's like they're getting to the issue and getting to the goal and, achieving what they had to achieve. In a way, it is like going back to some previous time where you could, have the time of someone at the other end of the line and have an in-depth conversation. And maybe that would be between two providers, or between a patient and a provider, or a payer and a provider. Who knows? But yeah, I kind of look at it as both an advance, and also in a way it's funnily a return to the past.
Yeah, the doctors actually would, well, in many parts of the world, you might have still doctor go and do visits and come actually to the home and that kind of world, as opposed to, you know, patient is lucky if you get 15 minutes with your provider, right? And
Right.
how can we like shuffle the patient in during the most efficient time so we could bill them for every single little thing? And I think that maybe this will help us get to a world where uh that is, just a better experience.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. I mean, there's lots going on. There's both proponents and opponents, and we have to be careful because some of the outstanding issues are privacy, security, the whole field of AI assurance, which covers a lot of ground. But, is the answer right? Is the AI making stuff up, hallucinating? And I don't want to minimize the challenges that we have in front of us using new architectural patterns like this. Don't mistake my enthusiasm for rash, diving in without looking. But yeah, all in all, I mean, it's promising. It's taken us a lot of years to get to where we are now, and it's going to take us a lot of years to deploy AI in this domain, which is 20% of our economy. But it's happening, and it's happening quickly. You see it with, even though there's, regulations haven't gotten there. We have lots of people pulling on the handbrake, saying caution, caution. But if you look at doctors and you look at this, what's actually happening on the ground, there are doctors using clinical decision support tools right now, and just like they use Google, it's even more powerful. So it's going to happen, and it, like any kind of technology, it could be for the good or it could be for the bad. And I sure hope that we all work together to make sure that we get good outcomes from the use of AI in healthcare.
Absolutely. We must always make sure that there's trust in the system and we don't undermine that trust. And I think the topic of AI governance is probably going to be a huge, huge area of a lot of research over the next couple of years. Well, I think this has been a really fascinating and insightful conversation, Mark. I really appreciate it.
Gene,
And
thank you for
hope our
inviting me.
listeners will. Yeah.
And yeah, it was great to meet you this weekend, and we shared a great experience, and I really appreciate your contribution.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your time. And I look forward to seeing our next Connectathon. Maybe there will be a follow-up working group and see what
Well, if
else
you drop this
we
cold,
can
we'll
work
be
on.
nowhere.
Yeah.
So we'll see you in January, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. And if you want to check out Out of the Fire podcast, you can look at any platform of podcast of your choice, and we're on there. And I also have a Fire IQ Playbook blog on Substack. And Mark, thank you very much. This has been terrific.
My pleasure.